to think about, as the country grows up, as the country expands, what sorts of growing pains might you expect to see? Some you may have heard about in previous history classes, but some you maybe can deduce or infer from your own prior knowledge. Here you can see the map of the growth of the United States, really the continental United States, with the exception of Alaska and Hawaii, was completed by 1853, and really by 1848. This small Gadsden Purchase down here was the final sort of piece of the puzzle here. But the major additions happened by 1848, and that's when the Mexican-American War happened. Today, we'll focus more on the Louisiana Purchase, which was bought from France in 1803. This is the first big addition to the country after the Revolutionary War. After the Revolution, we had control basically from the Atlantic to the Mississippi, and then you can see this big addition goes all the way up to the Rocky Mountains in the north and up to Texas in the south. The question I want to think about, though, is how do you just buy this much land, and how do you sort of declare control of it? I think in a lot of ways, we take for granted that treaties, sales, things like that just happen. But in reality, the French had sort of claimed Louisiana and then sold it to the United States without really having control or proper legitimate ownership of it. In reality, millions of native people were living on this territory all across the United States. And the United States bought the territory and just sort of disrespectfully ignored the native people. And of course, later on, it would become much more than disrespectful. It would become violent and dangerous. But before we get to the native people, I want to talk about Haiti. The Louisiana Purchase was driven by the world's first successful slave rebellion, which took place in Haiti from like about 1791 to 1803. France had a huge sort of economic resource in Haiti. Most of France's sugar and coffee, two very expensive and valuable resources, certainly at the time and still today really, came from Haiti. It was the major economic engine of France's colonial empire in the Americas. In order to grow this sugar and coffee, to process it, to harvest it, and to ship it, there was a tremendous number of enslaved people imported to Haiti. In fact, blacks outnumbered whites in Haiti roughly 10 to 1. As a result, the chances of a rebellion happening were very high, and the odds were much better in Haiti than they would be in any parts of the United States, where in some places enslaved people outnumbered whites, but never by such a large margin. So Toussaint L'Ouverture led the Haitians to victory, which ultimately led Emperor Napoleon to give up on his dream of a French empire in the Americas. Haiti was sort of the crown jewel for France, although they controlled a lot of territory in what's now the United States. New Orleans was the city that, to Napoleon at least, would be kind of the network, would connect the goods produced in Haiti to customers all throughout the United States through the Mississippi River. If you look back at the map, you can see, in fact, the key sort of trade route in the United States is through here, all along the river. And then, of course, it comes east, both this way and this way. When Haiti, which of course is down in the Caribbean, was lost, or the control of it was lost at least, it led Napoleon to decide, you know what, not worth it. And in fact, pretty quickly after that, he began conquest in Europe. He invaded Italy. He would eventually invade Russia, which did not go well. But Napoleon was set on expansion. And when he was defeated in Haiti, he took it as a big blow, not just to the French sort of fortunes, but also to his ego. And so he, in sort of a huff, gave up his attempts to control Haiti, to have an empire in the Americas, and left. The Louisiana Purchase nearly doubled the size of the United States. It's some of the best business the United States has ever conducted. $15 million was the purchase price in 1803. Today, that would equal out to about $316 million, which still, when you look at the territory, is a tremendously discounted price. At the time, Napoleon simply wanted to get out. He wanted some money to continue his war effort in Europe. And so it was a great, great deal for the United States in terms of finances, excuse me. And so France also was removed from the region. They no longer were sort of an adversary or a competitor for the United States. The only possessions that they retained in the Caribbean were Guadeloupe and Martinique, which are still part of France. Louisiana is 828,000 million square miles, excuse me, a huge, huge number. Most of it, perfect for agriculture. And so it became sort of the breadbasket of the United States, still today. A lot of the farmed goods that we consume come from the middle of the country, corn, wheat, things like that, largely coming from states like Oklahoma and Nebraska. I want you now to make a prediction. As you know, we added this new territory called the Louisiana Purchase, a huge amount of new land, much of it great for agriculture. What do you think the impact of adding such a huge amount of new land would be in the United States? What were some of the consequences? Make a prediction. Okay, it definitely stimulated the economy. It definitely sort of led to increased trade. Absolutely. Thank you, Jada. At the time, in the 1800s, how does the United States engage in agriculture? Who does the work of farming in the United States in the 1800s? Absolutely. Although the Louisiana Purchase was sort of was prompted by the biggest and most successful slave revolt in the world, in fact. In the United States, the Louisiana Purchase prompted a dramatic expansion in the practice of slavery, unfortunately. Of course, there was another consequence in the United States. In order to have farms, in order to have plantations, you need to clear out big areas of land. And naturally, people lived in that territory. And so it led to a lot of violence, a lot of conflict with Native people that, unfortunately, as we've discussed before, was sort of a hallmark of American expansion. Number one, there would be conflict with natives to take control of the land. Once the land was sort of properly cleared, then it would be enslaved people who would do the work of maintaining and making the land profitable, which they did. The land was extraordinarily profitable, and it was largely this expansion which made the United States a profitable, successful empire. You should remember this image from our work earlier this week. It's called American Progress by a man named John Gast. And I wanted to review it because it includes, to me, it's the best definition of manifest destiny, which is sort of the reasoning behind our expansion. It's defined as the belief that the United States was destined by God to expand and spread democracy and capitalism across the continent, from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And as we discussed, the primary characteristic of American capitalism, of our economic system, all the way up until the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, was chattel slavery. Now, chattel slavery is slightly distinct from slavery that you might have heard about. Of course, in some ways, slavery is an ancient practice. If you would lose a war historically, and even in the Bible, they talk about slavery as a punishment for a crime. But in the United States, that's not how it worked. People were enslaved just based on their, not just their skin color, but also their family heritage, right? If you were born to an enslaved mother, you would automatically become a slave. And that's sort of the unique aspect of American slavery. Manifest destiny, although it's remembered by some historians as sort of a triumphant march of progress, this painting clearly shows you that perspective, that this seems like a promising, positive, successful sort of expansion that, you know, doesn't seem to be violent, doesn't seem to be too tragic. Of course, that's not the reality. That's a version of history that is sugar-coated and ultimately isn't particularly honest.